Welcome to Deeper Thinking Podcast. The past does not remain behind us. It lingers, shaping the present in ways both seen and unseen, influencing our politics, our fears, our understanding of power itself. But what happens when history is not used as a guide, but as a weapon? When it is wielded not to illuminate complexity, but to flatten it? In the age of digital discourse, where arguments escalate at the speed of outrage, one comparison emerges with unsettling predictability. A debate on policy, a conversation about governance, suddenly someone invokes the Nazis. Not as a measured historical analogy, but as a final rhetorical escalation, collapsing nuance into absolute moral certainty. This is not just a failure of discourse, it is a failure of perception. When every political dispute is framed as a struggle between democracy and fascism, we risk losing our ability to identify real authoritarianism when it arises, not in the forms we expect, but in new, more insidious manifestations. This episode is not about dismissing historical parallels. It is about understanding when they clarify and when they deceive, because history does not repeat itself in the way we imagine. It evolves. And the greatest danger is not that we will relive the past, it is that we will fail to see its transformation until it is too late. The past is never truly past. It lingers embedded in the foundations of our institutions, the rhetoric of our leaders, the fears that shape our collective consciousness. It does not merely repeat itself in cycles, but transforms, mutates, adapts. Yet, in our attempts to interpret the present, we often reach backward, grasping for familiar historical parallels. And so, when political discourse escalates, when debates on policy, governance, or civil liberties reach a boiling point, one comparison emerges with unsettling predictability: the invocation of Nazi Germany. This is not a new phenomenon, but the digital age has amplified its velocity and inevitability. What begins as a measured conversation rapidly accelerates, escalating through Godwin's law, the unwritten rule that as any online discussion continues, the probability of a Hitler comparison approaches 1. It is a rhetorical reflex, an attempt to impose moral clarity on complexity. But this impulse is not merely an exaggeration. It is a conceptual failure that distorts both the past and the present. There is a seductive certainty in framing modern political disputes as battles between absolute good and absolute evil. Hitler, the archetype of historical villainy, provides a universal moral shorthand, a way to bypass nuance and declare ultimate moral high ground. To compare an opponent's policies to fascism is to frame them as an existential threat, to remove all ambiguity from the conversation. But this reflex, while emotionally compelling, is profoundly dangerous. It does not just weaken discourse, it weakens perception itself. To see fascism only in the aesthetic trappings of the past, jackboots, propaganda rallies, mass arrests, is to leave ourselves vulnerable to its modern incarnations. History, when overused as a rhetorical device, loses its power as a warning. If every politician is just like Hitler, then tyranny itself becomes an abstraction, a meaningless term invoked for rhetorical effect rather than analytical clarity. This is the danger of historical inflation. It does not just erode language, it dulls our ability to recognize real threats. Tyranny in the 21st century may not arrive with banners and marches, but through the slow erosion of democratic norms, the consolidation of economic power, the algorithmic manipulation of information. If we wait for oppression to announce itself in familiar forms, we may fail to see it emerging in real time. This is why precision in historical comparison is not pedantic, it is essential. There are moments when echoes of totalitarianism should ring loudly, when democratic institutions are dismantled, when rights are eroded under the guise of order. But recognizing these moments requires discipline, the ability to distinguish between historical echoes and historical inflation, between legitimate warnings and performative alarmism. The philosopher Michel Foucault argued that power is not something that exists only in dramatic, authoritarian spectacles. It is an omnipresent force, shaping how we think, what we accept as normal, what we fail to question. If we only pay attention when power takes on its most extreme form, we risk overlooking the ways it has already infiltrated our daily lives. The challenge before us is not simply to avoid hyperbolic comparisons. It is to recalibrate how we engage with history itself. If we continue to look only for the shadows of the past, we may be walking blindly into an unrecognized future. History does not repeat itself in the ways we expect. It does not resurrect its villains fully formed, marching in step with the imagery of old. Instead, it adapts, slipping into new disguises, learning from the mistakes of its predecessors. And yet we insist on framing the present through the lens of the past, assuming that authoritarianism will always arrive with the same symbols, the same rhetoric, the same violent spectacle. In doing so, we risk failing to see its subtler evolutions, those that do not resemble the horrors of the 20th century but are no less insidious. This is the paradox of historical awareness. While the past can serve as a guide, its overuse as a rhetorical weapon can blind us to the nuances of the present. We do not recognize power's new forms when we are too fixated on its old ones. The invocation of Nazi Germany as a universal reference point for tyranny reflects this failure, an intellectual shortcut that seeks to impose clarity where ambiguity reigns. It is easier to declare an opponent the new Hitler than to engage in the difficult, disciplined analysis of how modern threats to democracy function. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her exploration of totalitarianism, warned that the most effective regimes are often those that convince people no control is being exerted at all. The mechanisms of power evolve, becoming more subtle, more diffuse. Today, oppression does not always arrive through brute force. It emerges through manipulation of information, through the slow erosion of public trust, through the normalization of ideas that once would have been unthinkable. Consider how power operates in the present. Where once censorship was imposed by force, it is now achieved by flooding the public sphere with disinformation, making truth indistinguishable from fiction. Where once political dissidents were imprisoned en masse, today dissent can be neutralized through economic precarity, digital surveillance, and algorithmic suppression. Where once authoritarian leaders required military parades to display dominance, today power is consolidated quietly through the ownership of media, the control of financial systems, the erosion of democratic norms under the guise of pragmatism. This is why vigilance must be accompanied by discipline. If we only recognize authoritarianism when it looks like the past, we may not see it when it comes in an unfamiliar form. If we continue to invoke history carelessly, we risk missing its transformation in real time. The challenge is not merely to avoid rhetorical excess, but to cultivate deeper understanding of how power consolidates, how democracy erodes, how authoritarianism thrives in the digital age. Power does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrives as convenience, security, as necessity. And if we are waiting for history to repeat itself in its most recognizable form, we may already be living through its newest variation without realizing it. History is not a closed book, nor is it a static script that repeats itself with perfect fidelity. It is a force that mutates, that learns, that reshapes itself according to the conditions of the present. And yet, in our desperate attempt to make sense of contemporary threats, we cling to historical metaphors, wielding them as blunt instruments rather than tools of precise analysis. The result is a failure of recognition, a collective blindness to the ways in which power has evolved beyond the forms we have been taught to fear. This is the true danger of historical inflation. Not only does it erode the meaning of tyranny by overuse, but it also distorts our perception of modern threats. If we assume that authoritarianism will always arrive dressed as the past, we are less prepared to confront it when it manifests in unfamiliar ways. A government need not outlaw free speech if it can make the truth indistinguishable from lies. It does not need to impose martial law if it can engineer a climate of fear that compels self-censorship. It does not need to crush democratic institutions outright if it can slowly erode them until they are nothing more than hollow facades. The subtleties of modern power are precisely what make them so difficult to resist. Unlike the blunt force authoritarianism of the past, today's mechanisms of control operate through diffusion rather than direct oppression. Power does not always declare itself in the form of a dictator. It is embedded in economic systems, in technological infrastructure, in the silent normalization of new constraints. The erosion of freedom does not always begin with a crisis. Sometimes it happens so gradually that by the time we recognize what has been lost, it feels inevitable. This is why our approach to history must shift. It is not enough to invoke the past as a warning. We must learn how to recognize its new forms, how to anticipate its mutations. The most dangerous assumption we can make is that we will see oppression coming, that it will look as it did before. More often than not, it arrives quietly, not with a coup, but with a legal precedent, not with an overt crackdown, but with a new norm that goes unchallenged. We must rethink how we engage with history, not as a script to be replayed, but as a living, evolving force. The most critical question is not whether an event mirrors the past, but whether it poses a real and present threat to democracy, to human dignity, to the future we claim to defend. To recognize this is not to abandon historical memory, but to use it with the precision and responsibility it demands. Because the greatest danger is not that history will repeat itself, it is that it will do so in ways we fail to recognize until it is too late. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.